Just look at the flowers, Blue Beetle. Just look at the flowers. What is up, everybody? Welcome to my review of DC's latest release, Blue Beetle, and unfortunately, the latest head on the chopping block for DCEU. So what do we got? Aquaman left? So yeah, this is the penultimate chapter of the DCEU. Or is it? We'll get into that a little bit. But yeah, DCEU has had, I'd say a rough year, but they've had a rough few years. Yeah, the reboot that was announced by James Gunn and Peter Safran are going to head that up. That's going to start in 2025 with Superman Legacy, barring that there's no delays with all these strikes. And so all this year, they've been kind of trickling out their last few DCEU films, and they have been bombing, to put it lightly. You had Shazam 2 that completely ate shit at the theaters. You had Flash that wildly underperformed. And unfortunately, with Blue Beetle, walking into this, whether this was going to be a great movie, a terrible movie, a mediocre movie, we all know that this thing is going to be disastrous in the box office. Originally, this was supposed to be an HBO Max movie, but the people at Warner Brothers apparently were very impressed with it, and they said, you know what, this is worthy of the big screen. And back before they announced the reboot and we saw the box office of this year, that was very promising for this movie. Now, I don't really know a whole lot about the character of Blue Beetle. I have never seen anything animated or otherwise, never read a comic, so really the only genuine draw that I had to this movie besides morbid curiosity is Xolo Maridueña being cast as the lead character. I'm a big Cobra Kai fan, and I really like that kid. I think he's extremely talented, and if anybody of the younger generation of kids in Cobra Kai is going to have a really flourishing career, he seems to be the one. And so I just wanted to see what he was going to be able to do outside of Cobra Kai. But as far as the movie, the marketing really didn't do much to excite me. I mean, it looked cool enough, it looked interesting enough, but it also looked incredibly run-of-the-mill. It looked like about 3 dozen other movies that I've seen. The marketing didn't do a very good job at showing what is the pizzazz, what is the secret sauce, what is the reason that we should go see Blue Beetle that we haven't seen in other movies even just this year. And after walking in with mild expectations, to put it lightly, I'll be damned if I did not highly enjoy this movie and feel really bummed of the placement that it has been given and the cards that it has been dealt as one of the final chapters of the disintegrating DCEU. Starting off with the positives for Blue Beetle. The family element, that is the big difference that Blue Beetle brings. That is the unique aspect that it brings to the comic book movie genre. Now, there are a lot of things in this movie that I will talk about that you have seen before. Some will be far too many for a lot of comic book fans out there, but for me, as somebody who has not minced words, especially lately, about how fatigued and just sick to death I am of generic run-of-the-mill comic book films, to where they just feel like everything else that I have seen and don't offer anything really unique whatsoever, the characters are what is unique about this one. And that's extremely refreshing, because that was one of the big things that used to draw us to these comic book properties and used to keep us interested for sequels, is the characters, the titular heroes, maybe even the villains, the side characters, and the Reyes family in this movie is absolutely the heart and soul of Blue Beetle. From Xolo Maridueña himself as Blue Beetle, all the way through his family, down to George Lopez as his crazy, like, Doc Brown, Mexican Doc Brown, I think is what they called him, uncle. It's just such a fun dynamic that they bring, and a lot of really good chemistry between all of them. And the movie has some genuine fun with all of the different family dynamics, from his sister to even La Abuela herself, the heart and soul of the family, getting in on some action. So the family element is by far the thing that I enjoyed the most about this. And tying very directly into that, the Latino culture is all throughout this movie. And quite a bit of it I was able to pick up on because I've been around quite a few Latino people. I've seen a lot of movies. I've experienced the culture in many different ways. And there's a lot in here that I didn't quite pick up on, but I heard a few chuckles. I've seen a few people laugh about on Twitter, like the Vapo Rub and a few other things. So there are both very broad references and broad experiences that are brought to life here, as well as very niche and very culturally specific things in here. And again, family has always been one of the main important things in Latino culture, from what I understand. So That whole thing. It's like Fast and Furious tried to do that, tried to bring that to the mainstream and make that the heart and soul of their franchise, and at least 4 movies ago, it just turned into an eye-rolling joke. Family, family, family. This movie really nails that Latino family culture. And I breathed a gigantic sigh of relief that this is one of those good old-fashioned classic standalone origin stories. There is very little in this movie that has anything to do with the greater DC universe. Some of that I would assume is by design. Some of that might have to do with them not really knowing which universe this fits into, which again we'll discuss. But I love the fact that this was just a classic superhero origin story where we're focusing on the main character, that character's journey, that character's fight against the villain and the villainous plot, and we're not worried about setting up the next 5 movies. We're not worried about referencing other things going on. There's no cameos and wink and nod moments for the super fans. It's just a good old-fashioned focused superhero film. And my God, have I missed that. Don't get me wrong, the greater universe stuff is awesome when it's working, but it has not really been working at all for DC, and even in the MCU, it hasn't really been working for me lately, so I have grown really exhausted with the greater universe stuff, and I just miss these old school simple stories where we're focusing on one set of characters, and that's the only world that we're focused on. Maybe a sequel, maybe a couple sequels, but this ain't leading into a bunch of other bullshit that we have to worry about setting up in this 2-hour film. There's also a really nice mix of practical and CGI here, which is another huge sigh of relief after we watched The Flash, and I was like, oh my God, what are these effects? The Blue Beetle suit looks awesome. Even the side villain, kind of the main physical villain, his suit looks pretty cool. All of the flying sequences and the action sequences, and even just the look of the city itself, which I'm sure there's a lot of CGI there. There's a cool little neon look that the movie goes for, and it's certainly CGI heavy in a lot of things, but I think it's a good mix to where you don't lose that escapism. You don't start to see all these computer graphics that look like they're straight out of a PS2 game to where you just get yanked out of the movie. And so you see this ground level superhero doing ground level things and it all looks practical in camera, and then when it has to get a little larger than life, it's still convincing. I also really like the score to this one. It's got kind of an 80s synth flavor to it, a little reminiscent of maybe like Stranger Things or something, and again, it kind of feeds into that whole neon vibe that they're going for, and the posters and the logo and the way that the city is lit up, and even the color scheme of Blue Beetle and everything related to Blue Beetle. It was really neat, and the times when it needed to kick in and get you pumped up for an action sequence, it worked. I also thought the movie had a really nice pace and a pretty sharp wit to it as far as the sense of humor. Now, that's another thing that I have been extremely critical of in a lot of comic book films, to where the humor just feels low-hanging fruit, like a 4-year-old wrote it. And this movie, there was a number of jokes that fell flat that I didn't think were all that funny, but there's way more, and usually the ones that are more subtle, like somebody muttering something under their breath or somebody saying something in the background that you kind of have to listen out for, that were genuinely clever and funny. And when you got George Lopez in a movie, the movie better be good at the humor. And so, especially compared to a lot of other comic book films over the last 4 or 5 years, I think this is one of the funnier ones that we have gotten. Moving on to the mixed aspects is just the character of Blue Beetle. Now, I like the character, I like the suit, I'm intrigued, I want to see more. I think Xolo did a great job in the lead role, as I had all the confidence in the world that he would do. The only negative side of it is because this is such a family-focused movie, and we're trying to develop all these characters and develop all these relationships and character dynamics and get everybody a cool little standout moment. For an origin story, there's not as much development and as much focus on the titular character as you might expect. And so I would expect if we got a Blue Beetle 2, and I'm crossing my fingers that we do, that will be rectified very quickly, and we'll get to know more about Jaime Reyes and Blue Beetle and how he works himself, aside from just being a part of this family unit that is very much the focus of this first film. But if you're a big Blue Beetle fan, or if you're only there to see Xolo and you're not really into the family dynamic, which would shock me if anybody isn't by the time you're watching the film, you might not get enough out of the character in this first film. Now, something else I want to talk about in the mix, which it's not really a reflection on this movie, but I don't know where else the fuck to discuss it in this video, is where this movie is going to fit, because we've gotten a lot of unclear statements from James Gunn and from WB about what's going to be staying, what's going to be going, casting decisions that we don't know about, rumors of sequels of things in the DCEU that the star says is going to happen and then the studio says isn't. And the statement that he made on Michael Rosenbaum's podcast, which is awesome, by the way, if you're not a big fan of Inside of You, you need to become one because he's awesome. But he said basically that the first movie of the new DC universe is going to be Superman Legacy in 2025, but the first character of the DC universe is going to be Blue Beetle. And so that raises some weird questions, like, so does everything that happened in this movie just not part of the canon? Is it going to be a completely different character? Is it going to be recast? Are you just saying that in like a safe way of, we'll see how everybody likes the Blue Beetle movie before we make any commitments? And that feels the most likely to me, because this movie very easily could fit into either of these universes because they don't spend a whole lot of time referencing anything specific. You see LexCorp in the background, there's a reference to Batman, a couple of references to Superman, but very generic little lines just kind of placing you within this DC universe that is already kicking.
Whoa, it's like Batman stuff.
Batman's a fascist.
And so this could fit in the DCEU without a whole lot of questions, but this could also fit very easily in the upcoming universe and have no ties to the DCEU, and you wouldn't ask a whole lot of questions. And so when you watch this, there's a small amount of you, or maybe even a big amount of you for some people, that is going to be a little guarded and a little fearful of getting attached to these characters in this version of Blue Beetle, because they've been very nondescript so far about where the hell this thing fits. And after seeing it and enjoying it as much as I did, I really hope that they find a place in the DCU to make this canon and continue this version of these characters. Now moving on to the negatives, the main one for me, despite the fact that I adore her as an actress and I was excited to see her show up in something like this, Susan Sarandon is one of the most bland comic book villains I have ever seen in my life. And I don't necessarily think it's her performance, although you can kind of feel like she knows she's not given the best stuff to work with. I could just kind of see it in her eyes from the beginning of the movie. I'm like, oh yeah, she's not completely thrilled with this. But just narratively, the motivations that they give her, the characterizations that they give her, it's the most generic, military-minded person that wants more power. And we've seen that so many times and done significantly better. So as much as I love her as an actress and have so many movies in her past catalog that I adore, she added nothing to this movie, unfortunately. And moving beyond her, the thing that is going to break this movie for many people is that there is a lot about this film that is familiar to other comic book films, mostly in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which makes it a very dangerous, minefield to talk about, because God forbid you compare it to the MCU, you get the DC freaks that come in and start defending it, like, why are you comparing it to another universe? Because that's a pretty fucking easy comparison to make, asshole! I got a lot of original Iron Man vibes from this movie, and I mean that as a compliment, not as like DC's trying to rip off Iron Man. A lot of these characters in these different universes have a lot of similarities to each other. They've been around for decades. It's gonna happen. And we've seen so many heroes and so many villains brought to life on the big screen over the last 15, 20 years that we're at that point now where certain characters' powers are going to feel too similar to other characters, whether in the comic book world they came before them or not. And so there's a lot of elements to the story, to the main character arc in a lot of ways that reminded me of that first Iron Man film. There's a lot of similarities to Spider-Man Homecoming with this kind of young, somewhat immature kid that's trying to learn this technological suit. And you got kind of a version of Jarvis in here that he is talking with and developing a relationship with. You also have certain elements of like Ant-Man in here. And of course you have Blue Beetle in the name. It's not a joke. It literally feels like some aspects of the movie Ant-Man. And so there are a lot of things narratively, even visually, with him cutting a bus in half, which is something that we saw Doctor Strange do just a year or so ago, are going to give people those familiar feelings. And for some people, it might give them the feeling of, this is another comic book film that I feel like I've watched 24 times. And that's fair. For me, the family dynamic, the characters, the vibe of the movie, the style of it, and the fact that it was focused and it was just a classic origin story gave me enough that I've wanted and I've missed from having movies like this stand out that the familiarity side of it didn't bug me as much. So overall, guys, Blue Beetle was actually a genuine surprise for me. And I feel like this movie, it's a shame. It deserves better. It deserved a better draw of cards. It deserved a better release, because I feel like if it wasn't with all of the baggage and all of the negativity and all of just the exhaustion that people have had with the DCEU, this would actually be a pretty genuine hit. And I feel like when it goes to VOD and the word of mouth continues and people start to pick it up at home, this might have a little bit of a sleeper success later on. But as somebody who's been exhausted with comic book films lately, I got a lot of joy out of this one. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all my 2023 new release reviews so far. I'm also going to put my most recent ranking of the DCEU. If you like the universe, check that out. Like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.